The millionaire's girlfriend humiliated his childhood nanny, and what she did next was unbelievable. The sound of her heels still echoed in his mind. Not because of the steps, but because of the words. The coldness. The way she treated someone he had loved since he was a child, as if she were nothing more than just another servant. The mansion, once filled with laughter and voices, now felt deserted. Every corner of the house carried a silence that wasn't normal. It was the kind of silence that weighed on the walls, thick and heavy, like something precious had shattered, and no one dared to face the pieces. Liam walked down the stairs slowly, without urgency. Not because he was tired, but because he simply didn't want to reach the bottom. Each step was a reminder of what he had allowed to happen. Margaret's face, the woman who'd cared for him like a mother when he was just a little boy, wouldn't leave his thoughts. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She just lowered her eyes and left, quietly, and that was when he knew. She was far more hurt than she had let on. The moment had been brief, but brutal. His girlfriend, as poised as she was cruel, looked at Margaret as if she were worth nothing. She made snide comments, laughed mockingly, told her to go find something useful to do, right there, in front of the guests. And Liam said nothing. Frozen. He still didn't know why. Perhaps he never imagined anyone would dare speak to Margaret like that. Perhaps he was embarrassed. Or deep down, he already knew he was with the wrong person. Now, guilt weighed heavily on him. He wandered through the house, and everything reminded him of Margaret. The scent of her apple cake in the kitchen, the embroidered cushions she always insisted on arranging, the sound of her laughter when he told his exaggerated stories. Everything. But she wasn't there anymore. And worse, perhaps she never would be again. And it was only then, in the silence of that vast house, that he truly understood. The mistake wasn't just hers. It was his too. For allowing someone so special to be treated as if she were invisible. And for realizing far too late that true love doesn't come in diamonds or status. It comes in gestures, in presence, in respect. The pain he felt now wasn't only about Margaret's absence. It was about the version of himself he lost the moment he let her walk out in silence. In the back garden, the scent of fresh lavender mingled with a silence that felt heavier than the air itself. Margaret was watering the flowers as she always did, with calm, almost ceremonial movements, as though her hands knew every inch of that flowerbed by heart. She moved with the elegance of someone who never needed to demand attention to be noticed. Her posture was straight, her expression serene. No trace of anger or sadness. There was a rare kind of strength within her, the sort that isn't shouted or imposed, but simply exists. And that's precisely why it hurts more, when one only sees it too late. It was in this scene, between lavender and regret, that Edward appeared. His steps were hesitant, almost childlike, and when their eyes met, time seemed to fold in on itself. For a moment, he was no longer the wealthy man, the heir to a respected surname. He was just a boy, the same boy Margaret had cradled on feverish nights, taught to love with gestures rather than promises. And there she was, offering him that same gentle gaze as always, not as someone who forgives, but as someone who no longer expects anything. That tranquility wasn't comforting. It was a mirror, and in it, Edward saw himself, saw his cowardice, saw the silence that had screamed louder than any words could have on the night before. Because he remembered every second. Charlotte, merciless and mocking, had turned dinner into a stage for humiliation. The wine that spilled down Margaret's dress wasn't an accident. It was an attack. Cold, calculated, and he did nothing, pretended nothing had happened, forced a smile for the guests, looked away as though the pain were invisible. But Margaret had seen it, felt it, and said nothing, not because she agreed, but because over the years she had learned that some silences speak louder than any reply. The next day, the mansion felt different. The walls seemed to listen. The air carried something unspoken. That's when Albert, the butler who had served 3 generations of the family, looked Edward in the eye and said what no one else dared to say. "You may have inherited the Harrington name, but you've lost something no title will ever restore." There was no anger in his voice, just disappointment. The bitter kind, the kind you can't hide. Meanwhile, on the other side of the house, Margaret folded the stained dress slowly. To anyone else, it was just a garment. But to her, it was a symbol of finality. Each fold was a gesture of farewell, like someone gathering the remnants of a place that no longer feels like home. Like someone who knows that even the truest affection can die when left alone for too long. It was Emily, the youngest maid, who told Edward the truth. Margaret was leaving, without drama, without questions, without seeking applause for her departure. Just a small suitcase by the bed. And when Edward heard, something collapsed within him. It wasn't just sadness. It was a raw, quiet, primal fear. The kind of fear one doesn't speak aloud. The fear of losing something once thought eternal. The fear of realizing, far too late, that some presences are so deep, they're only truly seen when they are on the verge of vanishing. In that vast house, filled with luxury and walls adorned with art, Margaret was the one thing truly irreplaceable. And now, she was preparing to leave. And he, Edward, stood before the harshest of truths. Some losses make no sound, but they echo forever. Insecure, Edward ran. Not out of fear, but out of something far more terrifying. The sudden, crushing realization that he was about to lose the one constant presence in his life. For the first time, he felt that he could end up truly alone. Because Margaret wasn't just part of his past, she was the quiet heartbeat of that house. And the silence now surrounding him sounded very much like goodbye. When he found her, she was already prepared. Not with bags packed or a storm in her eyes, but with a calm resolve. There was no bitterness, no visible resentment. Just a quiet peace, the kind that comes when someone finally understands that fighting for a place where they're no longer welcome isn't worth the pain. They sat down. Neither knew how to begin. Words escaped them, but their eyes spoke volumes. Margaret was the one to break the silence, with the same gentle tone she once used to soothe the boy Edward had been. "Am I still part of this house?" The question cut through the air like a whisper that thundered. Edward tried to respond, but the words stuck in his throat. Because deep down, he already knew the answer. If she still belonged, she wouldn't have been treated like a burden. And he, the man who once called her my second mother, wouldn't have stood silently as she was diminished by someone who never understood her worth. Margaret didn't demand explanations. She didn't raise her voice. She simply said, "I'm not angry, but I am deeply disappointed." And those words hurt more than any shouting ever could. Because disappointment is born where love still lives. And wounded love, unspoken and ignored, leaves the deepest scars of all. Emily, too young to mask her heartbreak, broke the silence with tears in her eyes and a tremble in her voice. She looked directly at Edward and said what no one else dared to. "If you keep going like this, you'll lose her. And when that happens, you won't get her back." It wasn't a threat. It was a truth that landed like a stone to the chest. And in that moment, Edward realized time was no longer on his side. He looked at Margaret. There was still kindness in her eyes, but it was a distant kindness, fading, a tenderness that no longer reached out freely. And between them, there was now a chasm, a space once filled with trust, now empty. And no apology, no grand gesture would be enough to fill it. Not without something more. What came next would depend on him. Only him. On whether he could set aside the pride passed down to him, the ego built from titles, reputation, and expectations. On whether he could reach for her, not as a master of the house, but as a son. A man. A human being who finally understood that being present is not the same as giving love. And that time does not forgive those who let the essential slip away. This story might sound like fiction, but it lives in the quiet corners of real life. Margaret is every mother, every grandmother, every carer, every unseen woman who has given everything and received silence in return. And Edward. Edward is every one of us who only recognizes true affection when we feel the sting of its absence. Margaret's silence is the loudest cry a wounded heart can give. And it doesn't just echo through the halls of a grand house, it echoes inside each of us. Because at some point in life, we've all been Margaret. Or Edward. And the ending? That depends on you. Because maybe, right now, at this very moment, you are standing at the edge of that same chasm. And if you don't act, if you don't find the courage, if you don't move, the next silence might not be dramatic or loud. It might just be final. And when that moment comes, there'll be no more words, only absence. And the most painful regret of all. The regret of realizing everything, far too late.